Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the study on country safeguard systems, or CSS, of the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji, your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 13th thematic consultation topic or theme so far, and this is the 5th and final in a series of specific consultations and discussions on country safeguard systems, or CSS. More consultations and other themes, of course, are forthcoming in the coming months. In today's consultation, we are joined not only by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB, but also by Zara Abbas, a Principal Environment Specialist in the same department. For this 5th of 5 sessions on the theme of country safeguard systems, our consultation is primarily with CSOs and other non-governmental stakeholders of the ADB in South Asia and Central as well as West Asia. 34 of the 64 registered participants are external to the ADB system, and 8 countries from these regions are represented by 28 participants. Most of you have already joined previous consultations. Welcome back. In this consultation, Zara Abbas will present the main summary issues related to the study that she and her team have authored on country safeguard systems and the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguard Policy Update. From the presentations, we're hoping participants like you will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the previous policy and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming revised policy. Comments received from this consultation and hereafter will inform the revision of the ADB safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. To ensure we're all aware, you've consented already to the joining of this meeting and its recording. You've seen this when you joined, but just another refresher and reminder that this session is being recorded for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It's the intention that these recordings will be available to the ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to members of the consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address that's in the chat box now. Please ensure you're joining from a quiet, distraction-free area with your microphone off when not speaking. And during the Q&A session, when you're invited to do so, you can turn your microphone on and your video if you prefer to ask your question live. You may also ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand in the Zoom feature. Mr. Gelson Garcia and I will manage time to keep within our schedule. And should you experience any difficulties, IT or otherwise, please type them into the chat box and someone from our team will respond accordingly. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few polite guidance notes when using the important buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation available today in Hindi, Russian, and Urdu. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen, and then select your preferred language. Press the mute original audio button so you can hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter clearly. For those of you joining in Hindi, Russian, or Urdu, if you feel the simultaneous interpretation is too fast and that your interpreter is struggling to match the pace of the English speaker, you can ask the speaker to slow down by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button, you can then press the slow down button, which is the 2 reverse arrows in white, which are pointing to the left. This will allow the English speaker know to slow down their pace. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, and then click on the Rename button. Then type in the name, your name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button and then type your chat into the chat box. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language in any of the languages we have available today. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon. To show your video, click on the video icon. The next slide shows how we value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. And rather than read through all the points on the slide, let me just remind everybody that these sessions are being recorded and documented and will subsequently be distributed for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording or distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address shown on the bottom of your screen in the chat box. If you have any issues or concerns regarding the recording, confidentiality, the risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination, please contact the Secretariat again at the same email address that's on the slide or in the chat box. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize both your time and ours. First, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide some welcome and contextual remarks. Mr. Dunn is the Director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, Zara Abbas will share the main issues and findings of the nature and context of the study on CSS as related to the revision of the Safeguards Policy Statement and its forthcoming update. After the presentation by Ms. Abbas, we will have a brief 5-minute break. And when we resume, we will have a moderated discussion facilitated by Gelson Garcia. Gelson is the Senior Stakeholder Engagement Specialist on the Stakeholder Engagement team, also within the Safeguards Division, who will serve as the Q&A moderator. The moderation and the Q&A session will run for about 75 minutes. And a reminder that you may ask questions and share experiences in the chat box or live in Hindi, Russian, and Urdu, as well as, of course, English. You may also post your question anonymously by sending your question to Jennifer DeBellin or Jude Gonzalez, whose names appear in the chat box. Please send them a private message in the chat if you don't wish to reveal your identity. You may also send a message after this consultation to the Safeguards email address, and a response will be emailed back to you. This will also protect your identity. During the Q&A, Mr. Garcia will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversation. We will then have a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and indicative next steps following this consultation. As such, and without any further ado, I'd like to call upon Director Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim. And good day and welcome. Thank you so much to everyone for joining this regional consultation with civil society focused on country safeguard systems, or CSS for short. This session, I think, as many of you know, is being organised as part of the review and update of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS. For today, of course, we're pleased to see many of you joining us again. As Azim has mentioned, it's always great to have people return where we can continue a dialogue. We're looking forward to having some discussions with you. To start this session, I'd like, though, to just provide some brief background on the process of updating the Safeguard Policy Statement. We often do have new participants, so I like to just start by providing some of that context. As many of you know, ADB launched the process to update the Safeguard Policy Statement following a review on the effectiveness of the existing policy by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department. And that evaluation study had several key recommendations. The first was to update and modernize the Safeguard Policy Statement. The second, and very importantly for today, was to develop a new approach to strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. The third was for ADB to strengthen its own implementation framework for safeguards. The fourth was to enhance the guidance that we prepare to support the implementation of the policy. And then lastly, to focus more on building the skills and capacity of our own staff, but most importantly for our clients, both our developing member countries and other clients in the private sector. And that also, of course, extends to work that we may do with contractors that are often implementing projects. Now, the ADB management endorsed all of the recommendations, and then we launched a process to update the policy. At this stage, we are aiming for the update to be completed by March 2023, although we're keeping that date under review as we do further work. And of course, we will need to come together with stakeholders on the basis of a draft policy and seek to achieve consensus on that. Now, if you're looking for further information, you can go to our website. You'll find a background, a paper on the approach. You'll also see the stakeholder engagement plan. Plus, there is a growing list of analytical studies that we have prepared as a basis for these consultations. There is one on country safeguard systems, but there's also the catalogue of other papers that we've prepared and discussed in previous consultations. If you're looking for the link, my colleagues will be providing that in a moment through the chat box. Now, turning to today's consultation session, we're going to be focusing on experiences with the strengthening and use of country safeguard systems, or CSS. Now, this is a very important issue. One of the key objectives, actually, of the Safeguard Policy Statement was to help our borrowers and clients to strengthen their safeguard systems and to develop the capacity to manage environmental and social risks. And this is, in fact, a key development goal that I think we share with many, including with civil society, in terms of having strong country systems, having those developed across the region consistently in each country, of course, tailored to the particular contexts and circumstances in every country. But having strong safeguards at a country level, of course, is very important, not just for work projects that may be financed by international financial institutions such as the ADB, but of course for all projects in a country. So that's a development goal that we very much aspire to. Now, to support this, the ADB has allocated more than $50 million in technical assistance to support the strengthening of country systems over the last 10 years. This has included support for policy and legal reform in a number of countries, also the development of tools and guidance, plus support for training and other forms of capacity building. In addition, at project levels, we also typically piggyback or add on further technical assistance, and this can include support for technical experts, for studies and assessments, as well as support for implementation. It can include capacity and training. It can include additional support for monitoring and a range of others. So, fairly strong commitment that we've provided in terms of strengthening country systems, but it is actually a very much a long-term agenda and something that we need to remain focused on. And I think it's an area that we need to collaborate continuously on with a range of partners, including with civil society. Now, in addition, the Safeguard Policy Statement does include an option to use country systems instead of the ADB safeguard policy statement. But we've actually had limited uptake or success with this today. We had requests to be able to trigger this from 3 countries, from India, from Indonesia, and from Sri Lanka. We've undertaken very detailed assessments in each of those countries, but so far we've actually only accredited 1 agency in India for the use of country systems. This is the Power Grid Corporation in India. Now my colleague, Ms. Sarah Abbas, will provide some further details on the work that we've done in these countries, and also other background benchmarking studies that we've been doing, looking at ADB's own experience as well as the policies and experience of other multilateral financial institutions. There is, of course, a lot more to be done, and the Independent Evaluation Department, did, as I've said, recommend that we do need to look more at sort of practical approaches moving forward to continue this work on strengthening country safeguard systems. And of course, today we're looking forward to hearing your views on this, your experiences, perhaps with the countries that you're from, with their own systems in terms of strengths and weaknesses. You may have been involved also with ADB and some of our work and have perspectives on areas that we should focus more on in terms of policy and strengthening of systems. You may have also worked with other multilateral financial institutions and have some perspectives there. These will all be very helpful for us as we seek to update our own policy. And the recommendations that we receive feed back into the analytical work that we're doing, and then ultimately into the policy framing itself. So we're very much here today to listen to you. Now, before though we go to the discussion session, first we have a reasonably short presentation from my colleague Zara Abbas. So I'll now hand over to Zara to go straight into that presentation. Over to you, Zara. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon, everybody in South Asia and Central West Asia. So let me just give a bit of a background based on what Bruce just said. So can I have the first slide, please? Thank you. So the format that we'll be following for this presentation is that I'll first start with a brief background of how we did the study, and starting with the objectives and how the existing SPS covers the strengthening of country safeguard systems and the possible feasibility of using country safeguard systems. And also, in addition to this analysis, we undertook an analysis, a comparative analysis of our comparator MFIs, and that is also part of this report. Can I have the next slide, please? So the objective of the study was to learn from our experiences in implementing ADB's current safeguards policy in strengthening and use of country safeguard systems, and to propose next steps for consideration into the drafting of the next safeguards policy, updating this one. So for that purpose, as I mentioned, we also did a comparative analysis of what our comparator MFIs are doing in this area. And we have been studying many MFIs, and for country safeguard systems, we looked at those MFIs that have similar provisions in their safeguards policy that allow for the use of country safeguard systems. And then we looked at the challenges of how to undertake, how this would, what were the challenges in implementing this policy in our projects, in our bank. Can I have the next slide, please? So right up at the level of objectives, the safeguards policy statement emphasizes that ADB will help to develop the borrower's capacity and strengthen the borrower's capacity in managing environmental and social risks and in managing their country safeguard systems. So so what we see is that this in no way, it doesn't in any way undermine ADB's objectives through its safeguards policy. So in order to look at use of country safeguard systems, the first is at the objective level, we're talking about strengthening. Then for using safeguard systems, the SPS has provisions under as an appendix, which gives the details of how this should be done. It touches on the methodology. So in order to see whether a system can be used, ADB assesses the feasibility to use CSS through two types of assessments. One is an equivalence assessment, and that looks at, that assessment is designed to see that if this whether the CSS has the same objectives, and in addition to objectives, it also adheres to the policy scope, triggers, and the applicable principles of the safeguards policy. And whether the CSS is acceptable if implementation practices and track records are can be demonstrated to, and it sees that whether there is a commitment to implement the applicable laws and regulations and rules. Now, the CSS can be applied at the level of the country, like a national level, at the level of a sector, say transport, energy, or any other urban development sector, or at the level of an agency. An agency would be a subcomponent of the sector which is implementing a certain project. So, and this can be used, it can be applied, the CSS use can be applied to either of the safeguards, either of ADB safeguards, that is environment, involuntary resettlement, or indigenous peoples, or all of them together, depending on what the government wishes. So the use of CSS, as I said, has two steps. The first is an equivalence assessment, which looks at whether the CSS meets the objectives and also the policy scope and triggers. And then it goes into the next step. So this is the overall process. And accountability mechanism, ADB's accountability mechanism is also remains, the function remains intact, and so does ADB's supervisory roles. Both of them are, they remain if a project meets the requirements and CSS can be applied. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we also reviewed the approach of other MFIs, including Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank. These allow for the use of borrower systems in the projects that they finance. And we looked at what are the key features in their methodology to assess whether a CSS is feasible or not. So what we see is that both AIIB and IDB undertake reviews of the clients or the borrowers' safeguard systems. And if these are found to be materially consistent or functionally consistent, that's the terminology they use, with the objectives of their policy framework, and if the system is adequate to address the risks and impacts of the project for which it is proposed, then the use of CSS is allowed. Now we see with the World Bank that they also support the use of borrower systems if they address the risks and impacts of the project and achieves objectives materially consistent with the World Bank's environment and social standards. So they're very similar approaches. And what we see is that in all three cases, if there are gaps between the country systems and the safeguard framework of the MFI, then those are filled using gap filling time-bound action measures, which then become part of the legal agreements for that particular project. So this is the difference that we see, is that they have an objective levels requirement of consistency. In addition to this, the World Bank, in the case of the World Bank, there were some other observations that we made, and that was that the World Bank have recently supported the application of national labor laws in the place of the World Bank ESF's standard on labor and working conditions. And this is in selected cases where they found that the relevant labor organizations reported that national labor laws are successfully being implemented, where the law was robust and it was able to meet the requirements. So that was, but that's only in a very, very limited case, I believe, only one or two. Then there's another option that can be the project level use of CSS. So the World Bank in that case reviews the framework to assess the safeguards framework of the borrower to assess whether it will enable that project to meet objectives that are materially consistent with the ESSs, the environmental and social standards. So what the World Bank does is that it requests the borrower, at the request of the borrower, it can undertake an overview assessment of the borrower systems and in its implementation capacity, and that's done with the objective of identifying where the borrower's frameworks needs strengthening and look for avenues for building capacity and also providing support to build capacity. So this overview assessment can also be used to assess whether there's material consistency or not, but it's not necessarily done to do that. The main objective is to identify what are the capacity gaps and how can that be built. So that's a very important feature of the overview assessment. Next slide, please. So as Bruce mentioned earlier, one of the key recommendations of ADB's internal evaluation department's study or evaluation of the SPS was that ADB needs to adopt a new approach in its policy towards strengthening borrower systems, but with a view to a more systematic improvement and pragmatic use of country systems. So here it emphasizes that this approach needs to be systematic and sustained in a manner that if there are legislative reforms required, if there are policy changes required, if capacity development needs to be done, it should be done in a broader manner which can be sustained and possibly through a set of financing modalities that exist in ADB. One of the alternatives, as recommended by the IED report itself, was to, in moving towards CSS, is to have a progressive approach where you can use financing modalities such as the results-based lending. Next slide, please. So Bruce touched upon this, but I'll also go into a little more detail here. So we'll first look at what has ADB's experience been in strengthening country systems. So the safeguards policy, the SPS, came about in 2009, and it's been more than 10 years that it's been in implementation. And several projects have been financed under the safeguards policy. So in this period, ADB initiated more than $50 million worth of technical assistance initiatives across more than 40 DMCs for strengthening CSS. and assisted through country and regional specific capacity building assessments such as reviews and trainings and guidelines. So these were the type of interventions that took place under these technical assistances. These were done at the level of different departments, agencies, where guidance was developed or trainings were provided. So what a very important feature of building capacity of the national or local safeguard systems was that in 2016, a joint regional community of practice on safeguards was established for with the help of donor support, and there were the World Bank, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs, JICA of Japan, and ADB were part of this group. Did I mention World Bank? World Bank as well, yeah. So this was, and World Bank and ADB were providing a lot of capacity building support in Southeast Asia specifically. So in this regard, the overall goal of this COP was to bring this country safeguard systems to international good practice standards and share diagnostic work and ensure alignment of the partners' procedures on CSS. I mean, between the MFIs that were working, so to improve alignment. So in this respect, World Bank and ADB together established safeguards learning centers. And these learning centers were either based on existing learning centers or where they were expanded, such as universities or technical training programs. And these safeguards learning centers were expanded so that the staff from implementing agencies, line agencies, different departments involved in the overall safeguards arena can be trained and their capacity can be built in implementing safeguards. So 3 such centers were developed. One is in the Philippines, one is in Vietnam, and one is in Indonesia. And so this partnership proved to be very useful, and this is still ongoing and in this region. So can I have the next slide, please? So as I mentioned earlier, the safeguards policy in its objective requires strengthening of CSS. So the previous slide expanded on how over the past 10 years we've been working in the area of capacity building and strengthening of country systems. Now, the policy also has the provision to use CSS, as we explained the provisions previously. So here I'm going to just explain the few initiatives that ADB has been involved in, where the use of CSS was studied carefully and investigated on its feasibility. So in 2017, ADB reviewed the corporate safeguards framework of the Power Grid Corporation of India and approved the use of agency level, that would be at the level of Power Grid, so that CSS can be used, their safeguard systems, the Power Grid safeguard systems could be used for future ADB projects. Not only does Power Grid have its own safeguards framework, but it also has the authority to amend it or change it in any way that's needed. So the safeguards assessment, like the equivalence assessment, identified certain gaps, and a gap filling action plan was prepared, and that was included as part of the project's legal agreement. So following this first project that was approved for Power Grid, the period of 2017 to 2019, more countries also expressed their interest. And because as maybe I didn't mention it, but this is on a request-based pattern, that if a DMC of a developing member country requests the use, then it's looked into in detail. So the 3 countries were Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and India. So India also at the national level requested to assess the feasibility of using CSS. In 2017, the use of agency-level CSS for environment and involuntary resettlements safeguards was explored for Indonesia's state-owned electric company, PLN. So unlike the case of Power Grid that has its own safeguards framework, PLN, although it's a state-owned company, follows the National Safeguards Framework for implementing its project. What I mean is these are both companies. Power Grid was a company and so is PLN. So to assess equivalence, now how was that done? Each ADB safeguards policy principle for environment and involuntary resettlement, for the case of, as we were looking at PLN, was studied in detail. Now, in that, we looked at the several components of the law, of the national legal framework, which includes laws, regulations, both for environment and IR. And wherever gaps were found, gap filling measures were identified and discussed with PLN. This entire process took a long time for many reasons, because first was, of course, availability and accessibility of the detailed laws and regulations and their legal translation into English. And then in addition to that, also discussions with other line agencies which are involved in overall implementation of safeguards at the field level. So for acceptability, the implementation practices of PLN were also reviewed in a lot of detail. So in addition to talking to line agencies, discussions and consultations were also held with the World Bank, because as I mentioned, the World Bank together with ADB has been involved in Indonesia in building national capacity in safeguards implementation through the Safeguards Learning Centers. So the PLN Board of Directors has the authority to issue decrees that are legally binding for PLN staff and its contractors. So this feature of PLN made it possible to fill the equivalence gaps between the national safeguard systems and ADB's safeguards policy through a gap filling action plan. So this action plan was agreed upon between PLN and ADB, and PLN adopted a decree to implement the gap filling action plan. However, the proposal to use CSS, the next step after completing all the diagnostic work, the feasibility of the equivalence and acceptability, the next step is to submit the proposal to ADB's board for approval so that it can be used for a particular project. So this step could not be completed because towards the end of this stage, there were some changes in the legal framework of Indonesia, and the analysis had to be revised and updated. And then we all entered the period where the COVID-19 pandemic started, and there were delays because of that. So the next case I'll just go into is the India National case. Now, in this one, concurrent to the request from Power Grid to apply the use of their ESPP, in 2016, the Government of India also requested an overall national safeguards review for all three safeguards, as well as sector-level summary equivalence assessments for the power and energy sector and road transport sector. So for these two sectors. So in this case, draft equivalence assessment reports were prepared and shared with the government for feedback. Now, once this feedback is completed, it will be possible for ADB to finalize the assessments and then discuss the next steps with the Government of India. In parallel to the Indonesia assessments in 2017, we also initiated assessments for Sri Lanka. The government of Sri Lanka submitted a request, and the request was for the use of CSS by the Road Development Authority of Sri Lanka. And the RDA is also a state-owned enterprise similar to PLN, but in contrast to PLN, and also to Power Grid, it does not have the authority to issue binding directives. And it also follows the national laws in its implementation, in implementing safeguards. So similarly, assessments for equivalence were undertaken and also for acceptability, and gaps were identified in the environmental and involuntary resettlement safeguards frameworks, legal gaps. However, as I mentioned, since RDA did not have the authority to issue legally binding directives, it was not possible to legally fill the equivalence gaps with agency level regulations as was done for Power Grid. Going forward, ADB and RDA had discussions and agreed that what they saw as part of the acceptability assessment was that the implementation of safeguards was robust. And the staff were well trained, and they were it was done in a very good manner. But they requested that since they had safeguards training manuals and implementation manuals of their own, they wanted ADB to assist them with revising those because those were prepared earlier. And that there were certain issues that they wanted to of us to help them with. And so such as in the transport, since it was the transport sector, a big issue that they faced was that of roadkill of wildlife. And this is a very significant issue, and they wanted help from ADB in how to improve their safeguards implementation, and then ADB assisted them with that particular area and to build their capacity in implementing in the transport sector. Next slide, please. So this experience with the use of CSS and also of capacity building, we see that there are some significant challenges that ADB faces. Firstly, I think it's quite obvious, is that of establishing equivalence. Safeguards policy principles are very comprehensive and complex, and there are a range of requirements that are embedded in each single policy principle. And one policy principle might encompass many aspects and requirements, which when we compare them with national legal framework, it may be spread across more than one law and many regulations corresponding to these, and also regulatory bodies. It might be spread across these. So making this together makes the analysis of establishing equivalence very complex, lengthy, and a legal exercise. Another challenge observed with establishing equivalence itself is that equivalence is an ongoing dynamic process, as laws and regulations change from time to time, and sometimes regulations change, sometimes laws change and regulations both change, and there can be internal legally binding guidance that's issued that may change. So this requires that it may need to be revised or repeated completely or upgraded in certain areas. So this revision then also means that the public consultation process around the findings of the equivalence assessment needs to be repeated or done again in those areas. And then there's also what we observed as part of establishing equivalence was that there was a problem in trying to obtain accurate translations of the legal framework so that it can be compared against the SPS. Now, with filling these gaps, equivalence gaps, as I mentioned, can be filled where their agencies have the authority to make corporate rules that can fill these gaps, and where it is possible to agree with the agency on a gap filling action plan. So in cases where the agency does not have such authority, gap filling plans or measures just cannot be implemented. And then linked to this, we see the acceptability assessment. Now, if there are changes in the national legal framework, then implementation practice does not exist, and therefore there's a gap in that implementation practice, and how can that be measured? So this was another step that was difficult. And simply the requirements at the national level can be, for monitoring projects, can be different across different provinces or different areas, or can vary, and or they might not be that explicitly mentioned in the national legal framework. So it was very difficult to find information on project implementation to see what the implementation experience has been in that area or in that country. So this, we felt, would have been investigated properly if we could undertake field audits of projects, but that also requires a lot of time, and it's resource intensive in both time and capital. So that was the challenge in acceptability and as well. Next slide, please. So we'll try to see what were the lessons that we learned from this analysis. So there are about 5 key lessons that we can pick out of this when we study this whole situation. And the first and foremost is that there is a need to pursue early and strategic level engagement with our borrower countries and the governments. So how can we do this? Now, within ADB's business processes and plans, there is a provision of undertaking a country programming strategy, and these are developed for across regional departments, the operations departments for each country. And at that stage, it would be very good if dialogue can be initiated on what are the sectors of interest, what are the areas that where ADB is going to be working with the borrower, and what are the key safeguards issues that we need to engage in policy dialogue on. What are the gaps that can be assessed at that stage? So if an assessment of the legal framework is undertaken at the level of the CPS, or at the stage of when the CPS of a country is being prepared, we can identify, first of all, establish a baseline of what's there, and what are the gaps, and what are the indicators that we can monitor over time with our key implementing agencies that we will be working with. Now, in addition to continuing with the ongoing capacity building initiatives, such as the Safeguards Learning Centers that I just mentioned, that these could, first of all, they are being, as I said, implemented in Southeast Asia. This initiative can be replicated for other countries, and partnerships established with development partners who are also working in those countries, and establish similar safeguards learning centers linked either through existing capacity building departments within the country, or possibly establish new ones through universities or through other centers of learning in the country. And in addition to these, there is also a need to develop new approaches to build project level capacity at the implementation stage, or at the level of implementing projects. And this again can be linked to the country programming strategy, because at that stage, if you identify the key implementing agencies and the key sectors, then we can prioritize at that stage. Now, in order to mainstream safeguards good practice into CSS, institutional and legal reforms are vital, and they're needed so that we can implement these over time, and therefore it also requires long-term engagement. So dialogue on these can also begin at this stage of the CPS, and then the country programming strategy, and then monitored later on. So I'll just continue this on the next slide, where we'll go into a little more detail of how we can use all of this information. So what we can do is progressively strengthen the country safeguards systems, and linking that to safeguards outcomes and through financing modalities. Now, when we, in the previous slide, I mentioned long-term engagement to achieve legal reforms. So ADB's policy-based lending provides the opportunity to converge national systems towards good practices for safeguards through policy enhancements. So at the CPS stage, if policy gaps are identified and their priority sectors are also identified, and so policy-based lending can be one tool to bring about legal or regulatory changes in a certain area linked to safeguards, linked to a project, a conventional project. So that could be one area to go. So, so in addition to this, an existing modality that ADB has been using in the past and we were piloting it until a few years ago, and now it's being used, is the results-based lending. So in the results-based lending, the country safeguard systems are used, and this is at the level of a program. So if an implementing agency has a program and part of that program is then financed by ADB, then that can be what we do at that stage is that for the purpose of that program, this country safeguard systems are then assessed against ADB's safeguards policy. So ADB's safeguard policy becomes the compliance benchmark. And a program action plan, an action plan at the level of that program is prepared, which then can be used to fill the gaps between the program or the safeguards that the program would apply, which is essentially the country systems, and then implement that through an action plan. So RBLs can be also a means of progressively building safeguards capacity, first at the stage of the program, then at the stage of that institution, and then slowly spreading from there. So this will improve implementation practice and can, in the long run, enhance systems of that implementing agency. Now, based on the experience of the World Bank, as I mentioned earlier, we could also look at their experience and see what are the other areas where CSS can be used, but then also which can also result in strengthening of systems. So one could be by looking at the use of CSS at the level of a project, and by considering methods for achieving material consistency or functional consistency, such as the ones used by World Bank, AIIB, and IDB. So, but with the focus on achieving outcomes, safeguard outcomes that clearly address the project's social and environmental risks. So this is a possibility, but it needs to be studied more in terms of the methodology. And another area that could be explored further is the use of CSS at the level of a particular standard. So the standards approach, there are multiple standards. So as the World Bank has recently used it for using national labor laws after it was reported by international labor organizations that the national labor laws were being implemented successfully. So that is one option, that instead of using the standard on labor, the national laws on labor were used. So, but in each of these cases, gap filling actions are identified and prepared and implemented through a time-bound gap filling action plan, which needs to be part of the legal agreements. And this is already done under the results-based lending modality. So that is a lot of information to give you an idea of what are the systems that ADB has, how have we been strengthening country systems, how have we tried to use country systems, check their feasibility, and going forward, what are the areas available through which we can strengthen country systems, and what should be the next policy direction. and which should also be in line with the IED evaluation's recommendations. So with this, I will hand you back over to Azim, who will be then taking us into a discussion session. I hope this information will be useful for the discussion. Thank you so much. Azim?
Thanks, Sarah. And yes, very useful for the discussion, I think. That was a wonderfully comprehensive presentation. And thanks also for providing us with clarity and feedback on some of the comparative IFI processes related to the country safeguard system study, and in particular, the objective of how the ADB can help borrowers and clients strengthen CSS systems and develop capacities necessary to manage the various country-specific risks that you spoke about. And in particular, the acceptability and equivalency principles that you mentioned. I'd also, of course, like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. As Zara mentioned, we hope that we can get further feedback from you. The ADB is in listening mode, and in particular, the ADB wants to hear what it should be considering in these general policy topics and areas during the facilitated Q&A session that's coming up, that's going to run for about 75 minutes. Let's now, however, pause for a 5-minute break. Before we release you for the break, though, on the next slide, you'll see a countdown timer, which in the top right-hand corner will leave us with about 5 minutes. Oh, started a bit early. To have a bit of a break, stretch our legs, get something to drink, perhaps, just refresh ourselves. And while we're taking that refreshing pause, a question to all of us here on this consultation, please help us think about what we can do to specifically engage you better and other informants better, and provide us the feedback that's necessary to ensure a robust revision to the safeguards policy statement. Is this consultation the right way to go? Can it be improved? What specific improvements can be made to ensure that the dialogue, the discourse, the participation is apt and right for the level of engagement, for the level of stakeholders, and will be informed and incorporated into the safeguard policy statement? That's what we want to hear from you about, and you can post your answer to that at any point between now and, let's say, over the next 5 or 6 hours on the menti.com link that is posted in the chat box. But for now, let's leave for a 5-minute break. The countdown timer will let us know when it's time to come back to the screen, and we'll also be playing some music. So if you're stepping away from the screen, as you hear the music fade away, it'll give you an indication that it's time to return. So with that, we'll see you all in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Thanks very much and welcome back. We will now have the CSS study discussions as facilitated by Gelson Garcia. With Zara Abbas's and Bruce Dunn's contexts in mind, let's now hand it over to Gelson, who will take the questions in this order. First, any advanced questions that we had. Secondly, questions asked live through the raising of the hand function using the reaction button on the Zoom screen. And thirdly, through questions posted in the chat box. Mr. Garcia will prompt us with guide questions, the ones that we saw on the screen during the break, which will help us frame the conversation. And a reminder that we can ask questions in English, Hindi, Russian, or Urdu, and that you may also post your question anonymously by sending it to either Jennifer de Belen or Jude Gonzalez, whose names appear in the chat box. If you send them a private message, we'll be sure to ensure that your identity is protected. You may also send messages after this consultation to the Safeguards email address, and the response will be emailed back to you. This will also help protect your identity. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Bruce Dunn. But for now, I'd like to call upon Mr. Gelson Garcia to take over and facilitate the Q&A session. Gelson, if you please.
Thank you, Azim. Can you confirm if you hear me well?
Loud and clear, Gelson.
That's good. Thanks again. So good afternoon, everybody. We're now in the important part of the consultation, the moderated Q&A. This is the session when the ADB is in a listening mode, as it's time for your voices to get heard. As you know, this is the fifth and the last consultation on CSS, and we have approximately 75 minutes for listening and circling back to comments. We can extend for another 10 or 15 minutes if there is a long line of comments. I just want to mention some groups that are now in the room without being exhaustive, but I want to acknowledge the presence of representatives from the Coalition for Human Rights in Development in India, the Bangladesh Institute of Social Research Trust, WWF in India, Nepal, I think also WWF in Pakistan. I have my former colleague from Bangladesh, Initiative for Right View. Thanks for coming here, Joy, and Participatory Development Action from Bangladesh. Ryan from NGO Forum, welcome again. And then the International Accountability Project. So we hope to hear from you, because I know that this is a topic that is also close to your long-running advocacy on development. So as you are formulating your questions and comments, I just want to note a few things. First, we have mostly CSOs from, again, South Asia and Central West Asia. Maybe for many of you who are quite familiar with the ADB operations in the region, just a recap. If you combine these two regions, they have 16 member countries that form 33% of ADB's 49 regional member countries. In its 2021 annual report, this region said about half of ADB's lending commitments in 2020. It could change because a new ADB annual report will be released this week. And you know, this ADB's lending commitments go across many sectors of development finance, from infrastructure to public sector management, education, health, agriculture, natural resources, with the use of different lending instrument or financing modalities. So we'd like to hear your views on the topic that deals with the strengthening of and the approach to using CSS. Again, as defined in the 2009 SPS, let's begin with the very basic definition. CSS is the country's legal and institutional framework, consisting of its national and subnational or sectoral implementing institutions and relevant laws, regulations, rules and procedures that pertain to the policy areas of environmental and social safeguards. I know many of you who have engaged in, for example, the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness. The CSS is one of the important topics in those discussion in the declaration. And as you are from these two regions, you have direct experience working with communities and engaging with your respective governments in monitoring the implementation of safeguards in development projects. We also know that while the regulatory framework in each country is different over the years, some reforms have been made while others remain the same. But there's also a recognition that some have relevant, if not potentially equivalent or acceptable laws, regulations, and agency mechanisms. That's your country system. So given that background, we have sent you last week some 3 guide questions as part of the PowerPoint that was also sent for your pre-read. We hope that you get the chance to think through them. Again, as we're flashing on screen the 3 guide questions because I think these are going to prompt you for your intervention, but we're certainly not going to limit the conversation around this 3. No? To help us respond to your comments, we have Director Bruce Dunn and Zero Abbas. And we're also joined by ADB experts and practitioners to respond to your questions and feedback. We have Mr. Ricky Barba, the Principal Safeguards Specialist, who leads ADB Safeguards implementation for the South Asia Department, who himself was quite involved in the 2 CSS work in India, in Sri Lanka, which were mentioned in Zera's presentation. We also have Ms. Irina Novikova, the Principal Social Development Specialist, who is also in our panel. So now you know the basic rule. You can simply raise your hand if you wish to speak, write your questions in chat. We will call you accordingly. If you wish to send your questions but don't want to be mentioned, you can directly send them to me, to my colleague Jennifer and Josh. And also, if you feel more comfortable in your own language of choice, we have Hindi, Urdu, and Russian interpreters to assist you. So, okay, I see we can start the ball rolling now. And Ryan and Joy, I've seen that you have made some initial comments in chat. So, Ryan, can I first call you, and then hopefully colleague Joy will come in. Ryan.
Hi, Jason. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me properly. I'm a little bit on the road traveling. I wrote my question on the chat box, but I'll still go ahead. Earlier, Bruce mentioned that over $50 million were invested in strengthening country safeguard systems, right? And then in Zahra's presentation, we heard about the power utility company in India as the only one which can be used. So my question is, $50 million could have been better used for better risk assessments, for better information disclosure, for more robust livelihood and environmental restoration at the project site level. Then why use the CSS system when it didn't pan out, I guess, in a satisfactory manner? We heard CSS being invested in Kyrgyzstan, in Indonesia, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, but in the end, it was only one system in India. Was it really worth it for 50 million? That's the question. And while I'm here, I'll ask my follow-up question as well. Just going through, I think the moderator mentioned it's the 13th consultation so far. And in 13 consultations, we've covered a whole range of diverse issues, from FCAS to indigenous peoples to new issues such as gender and human rights and retaliation on the ground. So how does the CSS equivalency assessment pan out if these new themes within the safeguards under a performance standards approach are going to be adopted? Because it seems super challenging, as Zahra mentioned. that even for the case in Sri Lanka for RDA, when they were doing assessments on wildlife being trampled on highways and things, imagine the complexity of the large number of themes when we're coming to public utility companies and public engineering companies who have hardly no experience in social and anthropological work. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. I'm not sure where are you calling from. It looks like you are in somewhere outside the room, no? Okay. On that note, I'm going to call three colleagues from the ADB to respond. I think, Zara, can I please ask you to provide some clarification on where have we used the $50 million for? I think that will be important to, again, provide some elaboration. And Ricky, can you respond to Ryan's point on the power grid, please? Maybe it's time to also provide some elaboration there. And Bruce, if you could respond to Ryan's question on where does the CSS fit within the performance standards that ADB is considering, and considering that we have had so many thematic consultation that we have done so far and more coming. So, all right, so that's the line. So Zara, Ricky, and Bruce.
Thanks, Nelson. Thanks, Ryan, for that question. Yes, I'm trying to also open some file here to get some more information, but over this period of time, the various technical assistances that were done were for different aspects of country safeguard systems and not necessarily for the use of country safeguard systems. There was the case of Indonesia and Sri Lanka, which were looked at specifically for use, but when the SPS was formed or it came about in 2009, to fulfill the objective level requirement, smaller initiatives through smaller projects or smaller TAs took place, which looked at different things like possibly training, some trainings of, say, the power company, some training for transport level companies, implementing agencies, and in some cases some of these technical assistances had involved sub-projects, and the sub-projects were also areas where the government was interested in supplementing their systems. So it worked again on a request basis. So development of guidelines was one area, implementing trainings was another area. So there were lots of these, or in strengthening of training for civil servants was also done in some countries. So these were different types of programs, not necessarily focusing on capacity building from the point of view of using CSS. So that I just wanted to clarify that. In some cases, some laws were also, I think, looked at carefully. So the different types of analyses. Then the technical assistance for which covered the feasibility for Indonesia and Sri Lanka was specifically was basically directed at undertaking those feasibility assessments. But I think before we go to Ricky, maybe Bruce can expand on that a little bit. Would you like to, Bruce, on the TAs? Or we can hand it to Ricky, depends.
Oh, yeah, sure, Zara, thank you. And Ricky might come in after with some of his experiences from South Asia. Firstly, Ryan, thank you very much for joining from the NGO Forum, even though it does sound like you're on the road or out somewhere. I appreciate those two really good questions to kick off. Yeah, on the 50 million, as Sarah has said, that wasn't exclusively focused on or directed towards the use of CSS. That was one smaller subcomponent. There was a lot of wider support, including work in India around reform to involuntary resettlement legislation, collaboration in Vietnam that focused on helping the government to develop guidance on biodiversity assessment and the management of biodiversity offsets. So these types of examples where we work directly with governments on either supporting them with strengthening their existing policies or with developing guidance, plus a lot of training and capacity building. Other examples include the work that's being done in Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam to develop safeguard learning centers. These are like centers of excellence to support the training. And these are developed in a model where there is a local institution, for example, in the Philippines, the University of the Philippines. And they have benefited from support provided by ADB and the World Bank and others, but now they're taking forward their own programs. And these really are intended to build the country systems and build country capacity in a way that's much wider than anything that would just be more narrowly focused on ADB or the use of country systems by ADB. And then while I've got the floor, I'll address the second question as well. I mean, it's a very important point. Clearly, the scope of the new environmental and social safeguards policy that we're looking to develop with the ADB, it'll be broader and it'll be pushing the envelope further in terms of what would be considered as ADB's expectations, and you might also say the expectations for international good practice, greater focus on gender, vulnerable groups, disadvantaged groups, as we were mentioning. So yeah, this, obviously is going to push, there's going to be additional needs and capacity for our member countries, and that's something that we will have to support them on. So continues long-term agenda. So, I would say that the more important agenda here is continuing progress around strengthening systems. Use is really secondary. And of course, it's, where appropriate, that we've got equivalence and acceptability standards already in the existing policies. So if we can get there, then that's fantastic. But the bigger agenda is to really strengthen systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Before Ricky, Metis Ilagan has posted in the chat box the list of technical assistance projects for CSS. And I think this is also public. Okay, Ricky, on the power grid question, please. India.
Thank you, Gelson. So first of all, I will try to speak more slowly. I apologize particularly for the interpreters that I have probably tormented you in the last 5 sessions. So I'll try. And I do appreciate Ryan's question. I think we've had discussions with Ryan. I think everybody thinks, when resources are being used, what would be the biggest value? And on hindsight, I think when you are embarking on something that is fairly new, resource use will not be the most efficient. But I see that there has been progress in how we can forward CSS and being more effective in what resources we pour in. So I think the lessons in South Asia have been vast. I think the success of having it for Power Grid as a country safeguard system, which is approved, has built capacity, has removed the overlaps, particularly with other MDB projects of Power Grid. For example, the World Bank system also, because they are co-financing, or rather they are also financing Power Grid. But if we were to look at whether the resource use, for example, in Sri Lanka was a waste, I would say no, because actually I thought that it was most effectively used in Sri Lanka where although we weren't able to establish equivalence and therefore CSS could not be used, the capacity built as a result of building the manuals. Zara talked about the roadkill and wildlife roadkill. That's my favorite example, but as Zara has used that, it wasn't just that that methodology. It was also manuals on income restoration. It was also manuals on assessing occupational health and safety issues. It was also on, I think I've said livelihood restoration. I'm trying to think of the other manuals. Of cultural heritage, which is an important issue in Sri Lanka, given the importance of physical cultural heritage on many of the sites where these roads might have impacts on physical and cultural heritage. So it was, in a sense, also an investment in risk assessment and management. So that's the view. And I think if we follow Zara's presentation, you will see that the possibilities of moving CSS forward are now based on possibly more focused with methodologies that will probably be clearer and hopefully shorter. And so that is the direction. Again, I'm sorry, I apologize. Speaking slowly sort of messes my trend of thought, but I hope that I have shared that actually in South Asia, those CSS work has actually been quite good. And I think on the second question of now the potential new SPS would have wider coverage, I would maybe dare to say is the right phrase, but I would dare to say that CSS actually becomes more relevant when the coverage is broadened and capacity in the country, as well as alignment of their laws, guidelines, legislations would be even more important as more standards are put in place. And also capacity will be more important for government as well as ADB. Thank you. Gelson, back to you.
Thank you, Ricky. I wonder if Bruce has anything else to add on the second question, although Ricky has already partly answered it already about where the CSS fitted in the performance standards for ADB.
I think, I commented briefly on that earlier, and I think Ricky's addressed it. Of course, if we are looking at the use of CSS in the future, the benchmark will, of course, become the new policy. And if that's broader, then, of course, there'll be increasing challenges for showing equivalence and acceptability or similar benchmark. So that will no doubt still continue to be a challenge. But I think we have to continue that focus on building the systems. And it's, of course, a long-term development goal that's been shared by both the international development community and developing countries themselves. For example, if we think back to the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness or the Accra Agenda, like the Accra Agenda actually talks about capacity development and strengthening the capacity of countries, their own systems and the ownership of their own systems. And if we can get that to be stronger and more robust, like I said, it's going to have much wider implications for all projects in those countries than just ones that are more narrowly ring-fenced to development institutions. So I think we do need to continue to focus there.
Thanks, Bruce. So let me circle back to Ryan. And Ryan, don't worry about your mic because your audio is quite clear. Please do come in again, but perhaps it's also a good time to ask you because NGO Forum is a membership organization and that the CSS is one of the key areas of their advocacy with ADB. And I wondered if you have any follow-up question or points to make, Ryan, or any position that you would like to reiterate with respect to the CSS now that it's going to be much more relevant, increased relevance.
Thank you. Thanks, Gelson, for allowing me to come back. I guess, one just quick reaction here. I mean, I like Ricky's enthusiasm in terms of where the Sri Lankan example lies and work has been done there. And I do understand the fact that CSS is a slow build. So it's not going to happen overnight. And even as civil society, we do believe that national laws on environmental and social issues need to be strengthened. I mean, philosophically, I think there is no difference in opinion there. I guess from the COVID perspective and this pandemic recovery, the Ukrainian war, the energy crisis, the bankruptcy of the Sri Lankan government, the world is not utopian, that you're just going to invest in CSS and strengthen them and they're one day going to mature and going to get delivered. I mean, we're in a very, very dangerous and vulnerable place in South Asia. And just being mindful, the governments have very short regimes of 5 years, and elections change the direction in which public agencies gain favor from the ruling parties and which public agencies don't, right? So it's not a straightforward clinical systems thinking answer towards capacity building. And that's where I know not even the ADB has the answer for it, but we as civil society is, I guess we have to remind you that it is just not a perfect system here. And there's a lot of embedded corruption in the system. Large scale infrastructure in itself has proven to be leading to pocket holes of corruption within government, especially mid-tier levels of government. So if anti-corruption measures are not taken in consideration with CSS strengthening, we might not get the results that we're all hoping for.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. I think it's both a statement and a challenge, right? Because I know that CSS can also be challenged by the regime change. So can I circle back to you, Bruce, on how we've been dealing with that, yeah, you can say existential question, continuing question?
Yeah, well, no, I agree with Ryan. It's a huge challenge, and you said yourself, you know, it's a slow burn. It's a long-term process. We would agree, and I think it's something that we need to actually work together on. You know, we've collaborated a lot with other multilateral financial institutions, MDBs, and some of the bilaterals as well on strengthening systems, but we need to work very closely, of course, with governments themselves, but I think partnerships with civil society would be very important in terms of looking at issues, understanding priorities, and then working together to build capacity. And that includes with academic institutions. We heard that in some of the other consultations as well. So, you know, I think working together around building capacity, but you're absolutely right also on the governance challenges, and we need to be, you know, clear-eyed on that. And that's where I think we need to focus probably much more on the outcomes. I mean, we talk about the legal assessment and legal equivalence, but of course, even where laws and regulations are in place, we don't know, we know that they don't always get implemented or implemented effectively. And so, you know, that twin understanding of the legal frameworks, the capacity, and then of course the governance regimes, we've got to work on all that together. You know, so it's not a one-off type of intervention that's needed. But I mean, myself, I think this is a critical agenda that, you know, that we really need to work on. Getting the right type of environmental regulations, land laws, inclusion. Of course, there are many priorities, but I think this is a clear one that we do need to work on, but obviously strategically. And if we can draw lessons from what we've done before, then that's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So before I call Joy from IRB, Bangladesh, I just want to note that we have 25 to 30 minutes more for the Q&A. So I welcome other participants to please do come in. I know that we also have participants from Central and West Asia. And if you feel like speaking in Russian, we have the Russian interpreter here. So, all right. So Joy from Initiative for Right View, Bangladesh, please do come in.
Thank you, Jelson. Nice to see you and everyone. I just like to share a simple case study on Bangladesh. You can know that you are developing the SPS and reviewing it, but I like to just a simple thing to share with you that in Bangladesh, ADB is one of the biggest lender and help Bangladesh developing many policies like water policy and other things. And beside that, in 2004, ADB provided technical assistance to Bangladesh to develop a national involuntary resettlement policy to provide advisory technical assistance for preparation of a national policy on involuntary resettlement to strengthen the country. Now, now I like to know that what is the update of this resettlement policy support by ADB to Bangladesh. It was technical support provided to Bangladesh in 2004. So as you are developing the SPS and also strengthening the capacity of the community and their participation and other everything, and also there is relevant with the land acquisition issues also. So what till now ADB is the understanding with Bangladesh government to develop the resettlement policy in Bangladesh? Because every project ADB use the involuntary resettlement policy, and Bangladesh have not any policy to monitor or practice the governance or compete with the policy of ADB. So what kind of support you are providing to Bangladesh? I'd like to know this from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. It's good to see you. Maybe we can call on Ricky, and if Irina is back, maybe I could also ask her to supplement Ricky's on providing update on the national involuntary resettlement policy in Bangladesh, well, with the support from ADB's TA. So would like to start, Ricky?
Yes, thank you. And I will have to apologize, Joy, that working on the whole of South Asia with all the projects and the technical assistances, I am not readily aware of every single update, but I do understand that if I remember correctly, I do understand that support had been provided around 2004, if I remember correctly, and I think you also said 2004, and I think that led to the development of a draft, which has to be considered by the government. And I talk about other TA work that we do. Very often we do provide technical assistance on the development, but how the legislation is actually passed or approved is solely with the government. So and I'd like to echo what you explained, which is that currently we use SPS basically when there is no, obviously when there is no CSS agreement or approval, then we defer to ADB's policy. So the projects continue in Bangladesh continue to use SPS. Maybe if someone else has something to add, or Gelson, maybe I can take the time to just do a quick search and get back to you if I can answer that better. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So Bruce or anybody from our panel who would like to supplement Ricky's? We're supposed to have some Irina. Hopefully she will be back soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joy, for that. I have to admit, from the 2004 technical assistance, it's before I had joined ADB, and I'm not aware of that particular case. So hopefully Ricky and actually we're checking a little bit with some of our other team members in the background to get some further updates. But what Ricky also described, I've seen in other countries. We have requests for technical assistance to support the updates of policies and regulations, and when we do that, we would try to work with the country towards the adoption of international good practices as part of their policy framework. But of course, then the processes of government and whether they can come to consensus and get a new law passed, and with changing governments, etc., can be challenging. So we would normally set as an objective for the technical assistance to provide that support, but the outcome is, of course, dependent on the government, which, you know, very disappointing, of course, if that work goes in and it doesn't lead to the final change. Hopefully, though, colleagues may have some more updates within this session. And if not, then we'll come back after.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. And Joy, we will certainly circle back to you on that question even after this call, even after this meeting. But do you have any additional point to make with respect to the resettlement policy or any points related to CSS?
Yes, one thing, as we are working directly with the community on ADB issues, I like to mention that many cases, the policies written in the document and also committed is not implemented in ADB projects. I can share with you that like the Khula water policy, there is also the SPS, but it is not focused the gender, and it also mentioned that totally groundwater will not be used for drinking water. They will use the surface water, but till now in the project groundwater is using. So in this case, how the ADB authority can monitor or redress the problem of community or the commitment they are violated by implementing the project? If you have any direct community participation or other things, because in SPS there is no consultation in Bangladesh, and we are working more than 20 years with our ADB project, but we till now do not get any invitation or cannot able to participate in CSO or other engagement issues. It is continuously reducing. So I think the ADB authority consider this thing, and a lot of projects are implementing Bangladesh. So we need that community participation should be important more than the private sector involvement. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. I know that you have been engaged with the ADB for more than 20 years. I know you then. I know that you're quite involved in the Khulna water project. So perhaps this is a project level question, Joy. So we will note your points here, and I would actually invite you to. I think our team, Bruce and Ricky, will get back to you offline to discuss some project-specific issues. Although I know that this can also be a general issue with operations in Bangladesh. But I think we'll get back to you on that offline.
Yeah, Jilson, I just maybe pick up on a couple of points there. I do think maybe Ricky will come back in relation to Bangladesh or at the project level, but just to take it up to the policy level, because we are looking at updating and strengthening the policy.
Mm-hmm.
I took from Mr. Pasha Joy's comments a number of issues. One was strengthening monitoring at the local levels. He referred to what I imagine was within an environmental management plan or the project design, not to use groundwater and surface water instead, but then that didn't happen. So, there's clearly a monitoring issue that needed to be followed up. Now, we would normally have, for a Category A project with significant risks, third-party monitors that review the monitoring on the ground, as well as the monitoring reports prepared by the government agencies. And that should be picking up those issues. But if not, it needs to be strengthened. I think that is something we need to look at in terms of the new policy. The other aspect is the stakeholder engagement. At the moment, we have requirements in the policy for meaningful consultation. There's a definition there, but operationally, it hasn't really been well defined. And we're now looking at having a dedicated standard on stakeholder engagement and information disclosure, including clear requirements for stakeholder identification, stakeholder engagement plan, continuing engagement across the whole project cycle. So, that needs to be strengthened. And then linking those two issues together, there is certainly more scope for the use of local communities or civil society in monitoring processes. And that can come out also through the consultation processes, to identify the issues and to see where local communities can be involved. So these are some of the things that we'd like to strengthen, both in terms of implementation and the new policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So before I ask other participants to come in, Joy, we got your email, and we will convey that question or comments to the concerned operations department. Thanks. So this is now, we have another 15 minutes. So this is again an invitation to other participants who haven't spoken yet, without putting you on the spot. But if you would like to speak from an International Accountability Project, WWF, CHRD, please do come in. And I think while waiting for others to come in, can I call you again, Ricky? Because this discussion is primarily targeting the civil society groups from South Asia. Could you speak a bit more about the experience of CSS in Sri Lanka?
Gelson, I owe Joy something, and I apologize. I saw in the message that you were asking me something, but I was looking at documents to be able to get back to Joy on the land acquisition. So the 2004 TA was indeed closed sometime, I think 2008, and a TA completion report has been issued. It's actually available online. And basically, that TA was meant to be in phases, but it stopped in phase 1 and concluded in having a draft national policy on involuntary resettlement. So this was meant to complement the acquisition and requisition of immovable properties ordinance of 1982. So that was the intent. There was a draft. My understanding from the completion report is it addressed the broader issues, including livelihood. But again, there is a process, right? Because it needed to amend existing laws, etc. And then the policy had to be approved by cabinet. So that is where the TA stopped. It provided a draft policy on involuntary resettlement. If I understand correctly, subsequent to this, there was already an amendment to the ordinance. So that is where it was at. It was a TA that contributed to drafting national policy and including more broader issues like livelihood restoration. And Gelson, I know that when I missed that, there was a question on KULNA, and I understand that the decision is to refer Joy to the operations department, which I represent. So we will get back to that. Joy, is that a question on KULNA WASA project?
Yes, that is KULNA WASA project.
All right. So I will get the question that you posted and refer it to the project team for KULNA WASA.
So thank you. But I'd like to request you, if you please share me the report, and I can share you the mail, the last draft report to share on the resettlement policies.
All right, the completion report. Yes, surely I will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Gelson, you asked me a question. That's not what. That's not the answer to your question. Sorry, could you say that again?
I think there's an interest about knowing the experience of ADB on the CSS in Sri Lanka, because since this is a discussion with civil society groups in South Asia and Central and West Asia.
Right. So historically, the Roads Development Authority has been an agency that we have partnered for a long time. There have been several projects of ADB, including ones where safeguards had issues. And so there has been much work of ADB in terms of technical assistance and improving implementation of RDA. So that developed much capacity. There was a unit on environment and social that was established. And we feel that that is the basis of the request for Sri Lanka to undertake CSS for RDA. Also, that was following the successful story of power grids. So what happened then was that I think Zara had talked about this when the equivalence assessment was undertaken. There were gaps. And unlike Power Grid, RDA is unable to actually institute their own policies and procedures or decrees like PLN, for example. So this remained unequivalent if we follow the methodology of CSS. But we also looked at acceptability. There were issues in acceptability, but there was clear scope for capacity building. And RDA was very interested in that. They had manuals that applied not only for projects financed by MDBs, but also financed by the government of Sri Lanka. So improvements to those methodologies and manuals would be a very big contribution of the CSS work to improve that and build capacity. And so that was done with Zara and our consultants and Madhu. There were 5 modules added to the manual because it also introduced the changes in policy since the manuals of RDA was constituted. So maybe I'm talking too much. I can actually talk about this the whole day, but yes, let me know if that is sufficient.
All right, thanks, Ricky. Again, this is very instructive. So again, last call for others who haven't spoken yet. Or Ryan, this is again an invitation for you if you have any additional comment to make.
Sorry, Johnson. Took me a little bit of figuring out on the mute button. Well, I guess, I mean, it will boil down to us being, sounding like a broken record here. In the ADB SPS 2009, it's quite clear that country systems are going to be assessed against the ADB SPS 2009 policy, and then it is going to be reviewed, and whether that consideration of using the CSS is going to be adopted or not is going to be based on that equivalency. We hope that that is clearly upheld in the new policy as well. Obviously, it's a bigger challenge if we are going to look at multiple themes. I still didn't feel that that question was clearly answered, because we can only know that once the W paper is out, I suppose. And once all the themes, and whether it's going to be a hybrid approach, what's going to be the front-loading requirements and things like that. Once we know the actual architecture of the policy, then it would be very, very critical to look whether the equivalency assessment is going to be upheld and what kind of changes it will go through. But we're very interested in this space, and we'll pick this up in future consultations.
Thanks, Ryan. And I think that's a good way to also get Bruce back, because he can provide us again the future direction of CSS in the context of the new policy. And okay, and then again, I also acknowledge that Mr. Kwazi Baby from Bangladesh has raised his hand. So Bruce, would you like to quickly respond to Ryan before I call Mr. Kwazi?
Okay, and
if Kwazi is ready to come in, then we can take that first, and we can come back to Ryan's question, if that's okay, Ryan. It's an important one, but we'll come back to it. I'd like to hear from others, of course. So.
Okay, Kwazi, it's your turn.
thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Actually, we are working with the grassroots students in Bangladesh. So, but my question is, I know that ADB is working many constructional work activities in Bangladesh, and also after flood, they work on the embankment making, dam making, and there are many women that are suffering after disaster in the coastal area, but they don't have any house, strong house and strong embankment. They need that to support their shelter, because the shelter home is very far away from their house. So is there any program of ADB that are helping the grassroots women or the coastal women in Bangladesh? So we don't know it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Miss Quasi Baby, for I think you raised a very important question about ADB's program on infrastructure project, particularly those that are prone to flood and other disaster that affect women. What are you doing with this important sector? So who would like to respond, please? Is it Bruce or Ricky?
Quasi, thank you very much for that. I can't speak to the specifics for our Bangladesh country program. I would need to check. But that type of work around, let's say, coastal resilience, flood risk management, disaster response, climate change, those issues are areas that ADB is definitely working on and seeking to increase. For example, I'm aware of work that we've done in the Philippines in working with local communities around very much those same issues, including with women and girls. So there's certainly that work, and we're looking to try and upscale. Part of our current strategy is to provide additional support to countries' nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement and climate change, and to support countries' long-term strategies to address climate change. And of course, that includes also local level action plans to address community needs. For Bangladesh, I'm not sure Ricky's here, whether he knows of that work, but if not, I'd be happy to get in contact with our focal points that work on these issues at the country and regional level for South Asia.
Just very briefly, again, I'm not the right specialist on gender, but gender is covered by our country partnership strategy, and we can send the agreements on that, on how we will work with Bangladesh on gender. My understanding is there is a lot of work towards gender equity. There are also several PBLs. There's actually a program loan on social protection, which very much covers gender. So I could provide more details on the gender aspects of the ADB's assistance to Bangladesh if we have your information, and I can also ask my colleagues at SARD to help answer your question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, can I have any contact person name or email address?
Yes, if the team can send Miss Quasi, my email address is fine. Although Miss Quasi, I will be referring it also to our gender specialist in South Asia.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Miss Quasi. Yes, we will certainly give you the names of Ricky, his email, and I think we also got your email in the registration, Miss Quasi. Do you have any follow-up to make? Okay, I think you have closed your video. That's good. So we have Ashley Derek McDonald from the Coalition on Human Rights and Development. I can read your question or your point, Ashley, but would you like to come and speak?
Hi, Jelson. Thank you. I guess the first question, it's not a question, it's just reiterating the importance of assessing reprisal risks. Yeah. But the other question would be, with regards to the accountability mechanisms, when you say it remains unchanged, are the processes the same? Are the approaches the same when it comes to CSS, or are there any changes in how the accountability mechanisms can be accessed?
Thanks, Ashley. Let's pause for that before you mention the other point. So I'm going to call Zara, because as you know, this was also asked in previous CSS consultations. Question is, with the use of CSS, does ADB supervision and accountability mechanism still apply or intact? Zara?
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley and Jelson. what that means, which we still on the slide, it also state that ADB's overall role in supervision, because what happens if a project is approved to under CSS and under the CSS scheme, then it becomes a project like any other ADB project. It has the same loan agreements and other details. And in that capacity, then ADB's accountability mechanism also, the role also remains. Like if a project is out, the benchmark becomes the action plan, and the action plan is then reviewed and followed, and overall becomes the document or the framework which needs to be complied with. So if there's compliance, if there's any issue of compliance, or if there's any issue of any complaint kind of related to the OSPF window, and any of the two areas that we cover under the accountability mechanism policy, then that can be applied. So if there is a complainant and they feel that they want to complain, then the overall accountability mechanism is applies. And similarly, ADB's role as in the supervision capacity also is retained. So ADB still reviews the project performance as it goes along. So I hope that explained it. Bruce, do you want to add something to that?
Thanks, Sarah. You've covered it, but just to say briefly and very clearly, the role of the accountability mechanism does not change, even in the case that ADB applies the use of country safeguard systems. Project affected people would still be able to access the accountability mechanism in the same way. And the two windows that we have, one for problem solving and the other one to review compliance, whether ADB's complied with its own policies, remain unchanged. That investigative function also. So yeah, certainly have comfort that that can still be accessed. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce and Zara. And Ashley, back to you, because you mentioned very important point about stakeholder engagement, addressing the risk of reprisals and dealing with them in the context of project that might be applying the CSS. So I think you better say that. So back to you, Ashley.
I think you put that really well, Jelson. That was my question. I was more reiterating it. I've already brought that up in our last session. So if you can take that into account, and that'll be good.
So I think this question goes back to you, Bruce.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that. So we would not ever want to see intimidation, coercion, reprisals in any of the projects, and would take it very seriously if that occurred. In the case of using CSS, and to be clear, we've only really ever had one example where we've actually accredited the use of CSS, which is the India Power Grid example. But you know, if we were to do more accreditations, just remember that we're assessing equivalent legal policy frameworks, regulations to the ADB Safeguard Policy Statement. And the ADB Safeguard Policy Statement clearly has a requirement for meaningful consultation and to ensure that there's no coercion or intimidation. So of course, the policy framework has to be equivalent. We need to make sure that there is going to be not allowances, and not that any countries at a policy level would ever condone intimidation, but I think certainly the policy framework does not condone this, and we do not condone it, and we would not want to see it. And if there are any cases, we would want to investigate it. Now, moving forward though with the policy update, we'd like to make this clearer. I'd like to have a specific statement from the ADB with a position on no tolerance for reprisals. I think that's something we need to have very clearly in the policy itself. And then we need to develop more specific guidance for our own staff in terms of how to address these types of issues if they are raised. And we need to be very clear also with our borrowers and clients that this is not something that we would ever condone. So yeah, I guess in summary, not something we support now, and we want to make that even clearer in the new policy framework. Thank you.
Ashley, do you have any follow-up?
No, thank
Very
you.
good.
And thank you, Bruce, and thank you.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
Yeah, I think we have come to a point where you need to do some concluding response to Ryan's question about what can we see on the SPS in the context of a new policy or performance standards architecture. I know that you have addressed this before, but I think it's really worth reiterating what ADB is considering doing.
Yes, thank you. It's a really important question again from Ryan. So, you know, the structure of the policy that we're looking to have is multi-leveled. One is that we have the environmental and social policy for ADB, which sets out our roles and responsibilities, due diligence, the objectives of the policy, our commitments for the policy. But then there would be a set of standards, environmental and social standards for the borrowers, and each standard, for example, on environmental and social assessment or on labour and working conditions or stakeholder engagement, each one of those standards would set out clearly the objectives of the policy, the scope of the policy, and the requirements. Now, in the future, with that new policy framework, if we're going to consider the benchmark then for assessing the equivalence and acceptability would be against that new policy framework. So you've got clear objectives in the policy for the borrowers, and we need to assess against that. One thing, though, that we're considering maybe to change is right now, we've tried to approach this by really looking at, can we accredit national systems, or can we accredit a sector or an agency to be able to do this? But we do that process somewhat independently of the use for a specific project. Now, of course, we still need to do those assessments. The benchmarking analysis work has to be done at those levels. But we feel it's going to be much more important to link it down to specific projects where you know what is being proposed, what would be the risks in that particular project. And then you can go back and say, well, would the country system, the framework to be applied in that project situation, be able to address the risks? So you focus more on the outcome level. Can it achieve the outcomes that we would like to see given the risks in that particular setting? So that's somewhat an extension of what we have at the moment. We still have to work through the specific language and how to frame that up, but we think, you know, that more outcome and risk-based approach is going to be important. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think that's a good way to start transitioning to the poll. But maybe just to give you a quick stats on what happened to our 5 series of consultations on country safeguard system. We have engaged 350 registrants from all the member countries, and excluding the ADB, we have had 142 government stakeholders that registered in our consultations, and we have had 102 civil society organizations and independent consultants or contractors and other entities that registered in these consultations. I think just a quick stats for everybody. Thank you very much for this very insightful and productive discussion. I will now turn you over to Azim to do the quick poll and kindly ask you to join us for that before we give the floor to Bruce for the wrap-up. Azim?
Thanks very much, Gelson, and thanks for framing and contextualizing and moderating that very informative and spirited discussion on on the subject. Bruce Dunn, Zara, of course, Irina Novikova, yourself, Jelson, Ricky, and Patty Moore in the background, as well as all of those from the SEP and events management team working in the background. Thank you. But of course, the biggest thanks goes to you, the participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of experiences, and the general constructive nature of the feedback. I want to reiterate that the comments on this country safeguard systems that are being received will be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB's standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. But as Jelson mentioned, please don't go. On your screen, we'd love to hear your feedback of this particular event. You'll see a poll that's being flashed up there right now. Thank you very much for that, Jen. And we'd like to ask you to gauge the overall level of satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 5 for this particular consultation. Please rank us by typing a number between 1 and 5, 5 being the highest rank you can offer this consultation, 1 being the lowest, on your overall level of satisfaction with this particular consultation. Were you exceptionally satisfied, somewhat satisfied, or not at all satisfied? There's a range of scores in there, as you can read and see for yourself, and we'd like to wrap that up quite quickly. A reminder as well that if you have any ideas on how to improve the levels of engagement of this and other consultations, please go to the menti.com link that's also in the chat box. This will allow you to respond in 3 or 4 or 5 sentences with specific ideas on how we can improve the level of engagement, improve the level of discourse, improve our dialogue between each other so that we can have more effective, more efficient, and overall better consultations with you, the stakeholders. So with that, I'd like to read the results of the summary. Here we go. 14% have said that they scored this particular consultation neutral, and we've got an even split of 43% between highly satisfied and somewhat satisfied. All of that leads me to think that there's ample room for improvement of these consultations. And if you have specific ideas, which I hope that you do, on how we can specifically improve these consultations, please share them with us by following the menti.com link that's in the chat box now. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your feedback and overall participation. I'd now like to bring you back to the Director of SDCC and this overall process, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to give us a summary of what we've heard, as well as walk us through the next steps after this consultation. Bruce, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Azim. And thank you so much for everyone that's joined today. There was a really good set of issues that were raised, really important considerations that we need to think carefully about. I'll make just a very brief summary of some of the key points. I think firstly, there is an understanding, a shared understanding that national laws, systems and capacity do need to be strengthened. This is an important development agenda. But of course, it's also recognized that it's a long-term goal, a slow build, I think, as Ryan Hassan from the NGO Forum had mentioned. Strengthened international standards and policies of multilateral development banks like the ADB can help push country systems and capacity, but also as we expand the scope of our policy, that is going to make it more challenging for country systems to be aligned with, to achieve equivalence and acceptability. When we do that work, of course, we need to understand not just the legal frameworks, but the implementation. So that does speak to performance, but also the wider governance issues are going to be very important. We had some questions about ADB's past support, whether or not that's been well spent. We spoke a little bit about some of the areas that we have supported in the past with legal reform processes, with capacity development, guidance development. But of course, we need to be strategic. There are a range of priorities and we need to make sure that any technical assistance is very well targeted. Also, I think from my side, there is a clear need for us to work with other partners and to collaborate on that work, including with civil society and with academic organizations at country levels. But we had questions about the accountability mechanism. Does it apply in the context of using country safeguard systems? And that was answered, yes, it does. We also had some questions raised about the risks of reprisals and how would that be managed. And this is something that's been consistently coming up actually in consultation sessions for this policy update. And I think it's consistent with the global concerns and messaging around safe space for civil society and that being under threat. We recognize that as being very important, and we want to address that in the context of the policy. Plus, we had some project-specific and country-specific issues that were raised, for example, past experiences in Bangladesh and with the Khulna water work, and there was also a request for some support looking at gender issues and coastal resilience, and on some of those points we'll come back to. Now, of course, we've now had 5 sessions on this topic of country safeguard systems, and we've received a lot of good points and recommendations, both from developing member countries and from civil society. We have to take that on board and then consider the way forward. So the analytical study that we have prepared on this topic we'll be revisiting, we'll be updating, including some documentation on the consultation recommendations, and then we'll be translating that into some proposals for the draft policy. For those of you also that are interested in other consultation sessions, do refer to our website. We've got other topics that are going to be coming up, some interesting ones over the coming months on climate change, gender, and a number of aspects we'll be looking at on gender, including sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, and also, excuse me, sexual orientation and gender identity issues. Plus, we'll be doing studies and consultations on safeguards for different financial modalities and for the private sector. So, yeah, still quite a lot of ongoing work, but we're starting to bring that together, and we'll be working next into the policy formulation. So thank you very much for all of your feedback and for your continued engagement in the process. It's really appreciated. So thanks once again for joining, and until next time, take care, stay safe. Thank you.